Hello, everybody. Welcome to Answers Special Education Today for February 24th, 2025. I'm Kevin Daly for PATH. In this edition of Answers, there will be a special education update by yours truly. My special guest, Alyssa Norwood, will join us to talk about her organization, the Connecticut Age Well Collaborative. There will also be a short history of special education, part 1. As always, there will be time for Q&A with participants. Get ready to press the Q&A or chat buttons and send us your questions. Answers is brought to you by PATH, a nonprofit organization that for nearly 40 years has served Connecticut families. If you have questions about this webinar, please send me an email, kdaly@pathct.org. And while you're online, check out our website at pathct.org. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. And for a video of this webinar and all the webinars, go to the PATH channel on YouTube. And of course, there's always the fine print. This webinar is not legal advice, and it's not healthcare advice. In fact, it's not advice of any kind. The webinar is the sole property of PATH and not to be used for any other purpose. However, we encourage you to share links to the videos of this webinar. And now the special education update. This webinar premiered in March 2020, shortly after schools were shut down by the pandemic. Excuse me. At the time, parents of children with disabilities were worried. They were worried about their children's future more than ever. Institutions that children depended on were closed. There were many misconceptions about what would happen next. Parents had questions, and it wasn't easy to find answers. We made an effort to find those answers in webinars for the next 3 years. With the easing of the pandemic and the return to normal, this webinar went on standby 2 years ago. Right now, in February 2025, we're a month into a campaign of shock and awe coming from the powers that be in Washington, D.C. Institutions that families depend on are at risk of being stripped down or disappearing completely. People don't know what will happen next. Parents of children with disabilities are worried about their children's future more than ever. It's like deja vu all over again. Once again, people are looking for answers in an uncertain time. Once again, we will make an effort to provide those answers. And if we don't have them now, you can be sure we'll find them later. One of the greatest concerns parents have is the plan to shut down the U.S. Department of Education. You may have seen the headlines. DOE workers brace for shutdowns. There's a war on public education. Disability rights cases are stalled. And it's no secret. The long-term plan is to shut down the U.S. Department of Education and transfer its responsibilities to other federal agencies and eventually to the individual states. How will this affect special education students? Will special education disappear? What about our children's rights? Will they lose the right to a free and appropriate public education? Well, during the pandemic, when things were unclear, sometimes it was best to look at the future in terms of things we know, things we don't know, but we will learn. Let's look through that lens right now. For example, what we do know is there's a plan to close the U.S. Department of Education. What we don't know is how will it affect special education students. We do know this is not something new. Politicians in Washington, D.C. have been talking about abolishing the Department of Education since it was established in 1979. Another thing we know is that Congress created the U.S. Department of Education. It would take an act of Congress to shut it down, not an executive order. Now, there is a majority party in Congress, but the majority is slim. And there are members of the majority who have said they don't want the Department of Education to go away. Another thing we know, shutting down the Department of Education will not make the federal laws on special education disappear. In fact, the laws existed for years before the Department of Education was established. Special education was first administered by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, what we now call the Health and Human Services Department. The Department of Ed took responsibility after it was established in 1979. Another thing we know, here in Connecticut, we have state laws that mirror the federal law on special education. The rights of our special education students are preserved under state law. I mean State Statute 10-76. Whatever happens in Washington, D.C., in Connecticut, we still have state law protecting our children. One thing we don't know is exactly what we will lose if the Department of Education is shut down. For example, what will happen to the Office of Civil Rights? This is a division of the Department of Education that exists to promote equal access to education and the civil rights of our children. What about the Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP? This division of the Department of Education helps states comply with federal special education law. What will happen to the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services? This is one more division of the Department of Education that provides guidance to parents and school districts about federal special education law. And what about all the other Department of Education programs that benefit both special education students and typical students? And there are a ton of them. Will they be transferred to other federal agencies? Will the programs simply disappear? Will it be up to the individual states to do their own thing? And who will pay for it? As I said before, there are things we know, things we don't know, but we will find out. Meanwhile, here in Connecticut, one thing we do know is it appears that state funding for special education is about to get a boost. You may have seen the headlines. The governor wants to increase funding for special education. The state legislature wants to increase funding for special education. What we know is that it's likely to happen. There are state legislators who do not support an increase, but they are in the minority, and it would take an act of the legislature to make the money available. What we don't know are all the details. They'll come out over the next few weeks and months. I mean, details like how much. The governor wants to increase state funding for special education by $40 million and to provide $14 million in grants to school districts to expand their services and reduce outsourcing students to private programs. Will the state legislature play along? When will they show us the money? The governor wants the increase to take effect in 2 years. Some legislators want the funding to come now. So do many school district administrators. And how to fund? Our state government has a balanced budget mandate, spending caps, and financial guardrails. Even though our state treasury is doing very well, the effort to find exactly where to take the money from would stress the wits of a CPA and the horse sense of a Philadelphia lawyer. Just like the developments in Washington, D.C., most of what we know right now is what we don't know, but we will learn. Be sure to tune in on our next webinar on March 18th. There will be more updates on the latest developments. Coming up, the interview with my guest, Alyssa Norwood. But first, they say that having a child with special needs is a journey that most people haven't made before. And just like any journey, the focus is to move forward. But every now and then, it's a good idea to stop and look back to see how far you've gone. It can give you a greater appreciation of where you are right now. Up next is the history of special education, part 1. I hope it helps you appreciate just how far we've come in one generation. If you attended public school in the 1960s, like I did, you never saw another kid with a disability in your classroom, ever. Although kids with disabilities did exist. Kids with physical disabilities and kids with intellectual disabilities were walled off and kept away from the other students, segregated into different schools and private institutions. Some of them didn't go to school at all. Kids with hidden disabilities like ADHD, dyslexia, and emotional disorders, the kind of disabilities you can't tell just by looking, they could be found in the classroom too, along with the other students. But back in those bad old days, students with hidden disabilities were often regarded as lazy or problem students. And if these lazy problem students didn't mend their ways, they were usually ushered off to a special class in the basement of the school, next to the boiler room, far from the other students, sometimes never to return. It truly was the bad old days for students with disabilities. These days, public school students with disabilities have a very different experience. It's routine to see students with wheelchairs in classrooms along with their typical peers. Students with hidden disabilities have a better experience too. Public schools are required to identify these students and provide an appropriate education that matches their abilities. So what happened? How did we get here? What made public schools become a better place for students with disabilities just over a generation? Well, if you ask me, it was two federal laws from the 1970s that made public schools a better place. The Rehabilitation Act and Public Law 94-142. These laws changed the course of public education. The Rehabilitation Act goes back to 1973. It's a huge piece of legislation over 1,000 pages long. Here's a picture of President Richard M. Nixon signing it. The Rehabilitation Act is civil rights legislation from the 1970s, the golden era of civil rights. Its aim is to outlaw discrimination against people with disabilities, people of all ages, not just children, in education, employment, and housing. It's Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act that applies to public school students with disabilities and to any school that receives federal funds. It was Section 504 that ended the era when our children were routinely segregated into classrooms away from their peers. It was huge. It began a new era, the age of mainstreaming, as it was called at the time. For the first time in American history, students with disabilities had the civil right to be included in public school classrooms and activities with their typical peers whenever possible. This was unheard of. To help make it possible, Section 504 requires public schools to provide accommodations for students with disabilities, accommodations like modifications to school buildings, or in the classroom, allowing extra time, reducing assignments, modified textbooks, even the use of alternative testing, like oral testing, no writing. If you have a student with a 504 plan, all this probably sounds familiar to you. All the accommodations a student receives under Section 504 are written up in a document called a 504 plan. The 504 plan is updated yearly or when necessary. The accommodations in a 504 plan are determined by the student's 504 team. The team is composed of teachers, school staff, and the student's parents. Parents are the most important part of any school team. The 504 team determines if a student is eligible for 504, and it determines what modifications are needed. And if necessary, the 504 team can order evaluations to determine a student's levels of performance. Now, if your student has an IEP, all this might sound familiar to you too. It's because Section 504 was the forerunner of the law that created special education, which came 2 years later. It should be noted that Section 504 is an unfunded mandate. It provides no funding to schools to help them meet their obligations under 504. Unfunded mandates aren't very popular with public school administrators. They prefer the kind of mandates that come with funding. The other federal law from the 1970s is Public Law 94-142. also known as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, with its hopelessly outdated terminology. The story of PL 94-142 begins in 1975. By that time, it was clear that some students need more than 504 accommodations to succeed. Some students need a modified program with individualized instruction and related services that are aimed at their unique learning ability, which led to the creation of Public Law 94-142. It was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Gerald Ford in November 1975. PL 94-142 created the system of special education that we have today. Special education students would be eligible for everything they could get under Section 504, plus they would get a modified program with individualized instruction, like a special reading program or a math program, one that doesn't use the same methods that are used to instruct typical students, or a curriculum that's based on life skills rather than grade level academics, instruction to develop social skills, instruction to develop self-control, just to name a few. Like 504, everything a student receives was to be written up in a document, this time called an IEP, the Individualized Education Program. A student's IEP would be determined by a team of students, teachers, and school staff, and of course, the student's parents. Remember, parents are the most important part of any school team. Okay, maybe not the football team, but all the others. In Connecticut, we call this team a PPT team. In most states, it's just called an IEP team. Evaluations and assessments of student performance drive everything that happens in special education. In later years, PL 94-142 was renamed to IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the name that we still use today. It should be noted, IDEA is a funded mandate. It provides money to school districts to fund the cost of special education. When Congress passed the law 50 years ago, Congress promised to cover 40%, that's 40%, of the cost of special education by reimbursing school districts. And not once in 50 years has Congress ever lived up to that promise. The last time I checked, Congress covered only 18% of the cost, and that's a big difference. A difference that's made up by state funds and by your local property taxes. Every day in Connecticut classrooms and across the country, thousands and thousands of students depend on Section 504 and IDEA for support. As I pointed out, the two laws have much in common. However, in more ways than not, 504 and IDEA are very different animals. It's important not to confuse them. What the two laws share most is what they stand for: providing a free and appropriate public education to students with disabilities, and protecting our children from the mistakes of the past. Alyssa Norwood will be coming with us. Special education guru Rick Lavoie once said, the greatest obstacle to people with disabilities is people without disabilities, and that is so true. It's because people without disabilities often have attitudes that prevent people with disabilities from achieving their full potential. One could even say these attitudes are the real disabilities. These attitudes will affect our children throughout their lifespan, unless someone does something about it. My next guest, Alyssa Norwood, is doing something about it. Alyssa is the director of the Connecticut Age Well Collaborative. Alyssa, welcome to Answers.
Thanks so much for having me, Kevin, and thanks everyone for being here.
And let's get into it. Alyssa, what is the Connecticut Age Well Collaborative?
Sure, I'm so glad you asked. So, the Connecticut Age Well Collaborative is an initiative of a larger organization called Connecticut Community Care. And Connecticut Community Care for more than 40 years has been working statewide to help people live with independence and dignity in home and in community. In other words, people that choose not to live in an institutional setting get services and supports to help them thrive and live their best lives at home. And what's interesting in Connecticut Community Care's work in implementing home and community-based services is the point of influence of the care managers of Connecticut Community Care has really been on the home. So personal care assistance might be arranged for, a ramp might be built, but Kevin, you and everyone who's here knows that ultimately to be successful and to thrive in community, it's not just the home, but the entire community that needs to provide a supportive environment. So the Connecticut Age Well Collaborative is really the response to the community piece of home and community-based services. So we work directly with town governments in a very broad and holistic way to really help foster places that can support every age and every ability. So it's a big and lofty mission, and I'm so delighted that you're here and that all of the listeners are here so that we could all do this work together.
Well, it's good to have you here. Now, I understand that, well, like Rick Lavoie said, it's the attitudes that people have towards people with disabilities that really cause the disability. And I know that there are two concepts that the Age Well Collaborative is trying to counter, ableism and ageism. Would you please explain what those are?
Sure. And I guess I'll couch this in saying that all isms are, first of all isms are systems of oppression, and all systems of oppression are culturally and societally constructed, right? So this idea of something inherently being good than or worse than or better than, these are all socially constructed ideals, and all isms are a misstep or a not seeing the truth of the incredible spark within each of us, right? The essential humanity of all of us. So before I define those things, I just want to begin with the hope and the aspiration that the need to even define these terms and their existence will at some point disappear, and we won't need to talk about isms because we'll simply all see the essential humanity in each person and recognize that everything else, right? Appearance, personality, like all those surface things, that we'll have all done the collective work and have the insight to see past all of that. So that's the vision, and that's the hope that we won't need the definitions. But while we live in the container and the society and the conditions that we do, simply put, although heavy in its import, ageism is the systematic marginalization, discrimination, and oppression of older adults. And a cousin of ageism, ableism, is the systematic marginalization, discrimination, and oppression of people with a disability. And oppression is this big and heavy and weighty word, but what it really represents is that there's this big ecosystem that we create through a series of individual actions. So oppression is big, but each of us, through our personal power and through the choices that we make and through introspection and awareness, have the ability to start disrupting and eroding the foundations of this big, heavy thing that everyone here, whether as a parent, a policymaker, or somebody with lived experience, has probably had direct experience with.
I could probably name a dozen examples right off the top of my head based on
Yeah.
parents and families that I know. Um, well, let's for a second assume that I'm the parent of a special education student who attends middle school. Why should I be concerned about ageism?
So it's really interesting because my background and my origin story in this work was in the aging side of this equation. And there's this really interesting thing that happens that I've seen when you have conversations about ageism, this idea of systemic oppression. Oh, you and say, well, I may be old, but at least I can walk. Or I may be old, but I still have all of my mental sharpness and my clarity. Or I may be old, but at least I can see. And the justification for my ability to be in the world suddenly becomes about my ability. So it's a very common tension where the response to ageism sometimes ends up being ableism, and vice versa in the disability community. Well, I may be somebody that uses an assistive mobility device, but at least I'm not old. And, pitting against each other in this way and the toxicity that can create instead of the tremendous opportunity that comes from, well, we have a shared challenge, these two communities, of not being seen at these deeper levels that we spoke of when, you first asked me this question. Can't we work together? And aren't we stronger together to counter this narrative? So that's one response, that we're stronger together when these different communities work to counter the isms. And then the other reason, of course, is aging is living, right? The moment we're born, we're aging. Aging tends to be associated with older adulthood, but really it's just the natural process of being alive, of change over time. So it's this universal condition, if you want to frame it negatively or positively, but can we just be in the isness of the fact that as biological beings, we change from one moment to the next, from one moment to the next, and that aging is something perhaps to be celebrated. And this universal idea that even if you do limit this notion of aging to older adulthood, that if we're all lucky enough to live long, robust, healthy lives, that ultimately all of us at whatever age we are either going to have a loved one who faces ageism or our future selves. So, can we all be part of this dialogue? So that's a second reason. And yet the third reason is that there's a close cousin of ageism, and that's adultism. So we talked before about the systemic marginalization, discrimination, and oppression of older adults, but we know that younger adults also face those things based on age. So there's this interesting opportunity across the lifespan that people living with disability, people outside this very narrow age margin in midlife that don't face discrimination based on age. That there are these two extremes, younger adults and older adults, that all of us outside this very narrow ideal of an able-bodied, able-minded mid-life person, right? This very narrow demographic that probably doesn't even exist if we all look at ourselves with some honesty. That there's tremendous opportunity for all of us to come together and have a conversation to start disrupting and dismantling these systems.
I take it from you that the way to counter ableism and ageism is to promote inclusion and including people in their communities, no matter what age or what their abilities are. And I certainly subscribe to that notion. But can you tell me how do ableism and ageism keep people with disabilities from being fully included in their communities?
Yeah, it's a great question. So any ism, right? Like any system of oppression, by its very definition, is exclusionary. And the insidiousness of it is that the behavior becomes normalized, right? It becomes invisible. So one example on the ageism side of the equation is somebody who you haven't seen in a while might come up to you and say, "You look good for your age." That's a culturally normative comment. We don't even pause, stop, think about, well, what, like that qualifier for your age, what, it's subtle, right? It sneaks in there. So there's a lot of these kind of sneaky things, or just walk up and down the aisles, in any drugstore and look at the birthday cards, and they'll be replete with these like very culturally normative but highly exclusionary kind of phraseology that gets in under our skin, so we don't even see it. And there's a really interesting article in 2018 called The Waters of Systems Change that got published. And they talked about how so much advocacy, whether it's in the aging or the disability realm, for good reason, based on the historical presentation that you just provided, is focused on changing laws, changing guidelines, directing money and resources. And there's a lot of focus and effort that goes into that aspect of change. That's explicit change. But the Waters of Systems Change posits that there's a lot more going on underneath the surface. There's power dynamics, there's relationships, and all of that emanates from mental modes. So, what unconsciously, what biases are we carrying around as a result of our own personal circumstances growing up, of larger forces and causes and conditions of that moment that maybe we walked up and down the aisles and saw the birthday cards or heard the comments, and it got into our consciousness, and then all of that flows into policy making. So you talked about the classroom experience. It's everywhere, but another example, of course, is in the whole history of housing, and how as a society, as a community, as a municipality, what it looks like to provide meaningful choice in housing, to people with disabilities. And that in and of itself is a broad category. But if we walk around with an unconscious bias that emanates from a stereotype, right? An assumption that isn't necessarily true. So that false assumption might be all people with disabilities can't live independently. That stereotype becomes a bias. And then that bias becomes discrimination, where all of a sudden it might be impossible for someone in a community because of the perceptions of a landlord or a homeowner. So that grows into oppression, that then gets internalized as a belief by the person who's being oppressed. I'm not somebody who can live independently. And then that creates difference. And you have people suddenly divided into categories based on social identity. So we grow and spiral very quickly from these very small, subtle, insidious ideas into entire systems that spring up around and reinforce this notion of difference. And so it goes. And that's the cycle of oppression. And that's through these conversations and through the really hard introspective work at looking at personal bias, how we dismantle it. And something else I want to say is to be human is to have bias, right? We're all the product of causes of conditions. It's not our fault. Our brains are wired to sort information in a really complex world. And from a very young age, we form these systems of ideas and beliefs. And the courage and the bravery comes from saying, I'm going to pause, and in a world that really draws me externally all the time, that teaches me that I'm supposed to look online for answers or listen to the news or listen to Kevin, that this is a moment to pause and say, well, can I be self-reflective, and can I go in and can I look at the things that maybe make me uncomfortable? Because this work begins with each of us, and sitting in our own discomfort and bringing what's unconscious into consciousness. Because once you see it, once you know, oh, that's a story that I got from, a relative or from a news outlet or from something that this isn't mine, but it planted itself in my consciousness and I didn't even know it was there. Ah, now I see it. Now I can move differently in the world because I've brought that into awareness. And that's the movement that we're trying to build. And it's very courageous and important work.
It is, but you're up against so much. You're up against what is essentially our culture, where these biases are built into the culture. How do you combat these parts of our culture? How do you change our culture?
Yeah. So, one inquiry and one conversation at a time. And it's certainly not work that we could do alone. So we're excited to be part of an ecosystem of great, bold, brave people and part of a history and part of a continuum. And this work won't be finished in our lifetime. But the way that we're doing it is one, we needed to pick a place of focus. So we believe deeply in the power of local government to be change agents and in the opportunity that comes from teaching governmental leaders to share power and to think about all of the ways that local governments use consultants. What would it look like meaningfully and systematically to be in partnership with community members with lived experience of ageism and ableism to inform policy making? So that's the big, lofty goal. How we do that at the ground level is we bring people into conversations in a couple of different ways. So, one is we have a campaign that we started last year called Every Age, Every Ability. And it was co-created statewide with a number of different individuals, both over the age of 60 and individuals living with a disability. And we asked them the question, as you age or living with a disability, what words would you want to have people describe you? So we collected a number of different words. And then we also shared a number of different images and said, of these images, what speaks to you? How would you want to be seen? So we synthesized all of this information and, we conducted some key informant interviews and we launched an initial campaign that's meant to be a conversation starter centered around words that Connecticut residents selected. So, for example, one of the words was thriving. So we have this beautiful series of posters that say we are thriving. And then it takes you into this really interesting space of self-inquiry when you look at the word and then you look at the posters, because most people, whether they're aware of their bias or not, when you say the word thriving, and this might be an exercise that we can all do right now, to just close your eyes for a moment or go inward and think without overthinking it, what's the first image that comes to your mind of a face of a person when you hear the word thriving? And it's interesting because it might not be, and in fact, often isn't what you see on the posters, because our posters are populated with a mixture of people who are older adults who live with visible disabilities or who live with invisible disabilities. And there's this really interesting conversation that starts to happen because you're invited into this space of a little cognitive dissonance. Oh, that photo's not what I first thought of when I heard the word thriving or when I heard the word connected. I thought that all older adults or people with disabilities were isolated. And it starts to help people deconstruct the stories that we've generated through no fault of our own. So the campaign has a conversation guide associated with it, and anyone can download it and go through this exercise and sit, in a classroom or with faculty at a school or with policymakers. And, it can be a conversation that lasts minutes, an hour, but it's an entry point to start building awareness. So that's one way we start deconstructing. And then for communities that want to go deeper, we have a program called a Daring Dialogue. And that's a 2.5 hour workshop that's a much deeper dive. So that's the beginning of an answer to your question. But I'll pause there so people can kind of just take it in and start thinking, and also can check out our website if they're interested. The posters are available for download.
You do a lot. You definitely do a lot. I have another question for you, but before that, I see we have a question coming in through the Q&A. And the question is, what kind of impact will the disruption in Washington have on special education services in Connecticut? And that seems to be the question of the moment. And there is a lot of information that we don't have. If taking it to the extreme, the Department of Education is closed down. Like I said earlier, the laws that protect our children and define their rights, they won't go away. What will happen generally is that education, which is now centralized coming out of Washington, D.C., where they write the rules and figure out all the money, it will become decentralized. The ultimate goal is to have the individual states take on the work that is done for them by the U.S. Department of Education. And of course, the money that would come for that would be in the form of block grants that states could use for any purpose at all. So depending on what state you live in, the closing of the U.S. Department of Education could have a lot more impact than in others. Here in Connecticut, we do have state law that mirrors the federal special education laws, so we're okay. But the factor is money. Will there be enough money coming from Washington? Will there be a tax savings? There's so much going on that we don't know. The details won't be coming out for a while. And as they come out, please tune to this monthly webinar. Every month for the next year, we're going to be looking at every step of the way as this whole thing plays out. So I guess the short answer to that question is we don't know exactly, but we will find out.
You
And
know, Kevin, I appreciate you bringing the conversation through that question, and thanks for whoever asked it back to the federal landscape, because ultimately, you know, I'm very aware in these highly uncertain times, and appreciative of anyone who might say, you know, there are such big cosmic questions and unknowns right now. Why should I be focused on local government? And why should I be thinking about how to disrupt ageism and ableism? And I think, you know, my best response to that is one, there's a very large ecosystem and opportunity to impact change, and there are differing philosophies as to where the greatest impact is. But the Connecticut Age Well Collaborative's personal philosophy, you know, there's an old story of somebody who says, I want to change the world. How do I change the world? And you know, then they sit and they reflect and they realize, well, that's too big a goal. I should change my state. Well, you know, how do I change my state? And so goes the conversation till the person thinks about their local government, and then how do I change my household, and how do I change my family? And then ultimately it all comes back to, well, I have to start by changing myself. So the opportunity, I think, in working in this kind of very introspective and self-reflective way is that we're working from the inside out, and there's such power in that, and the opportunity to radiate that power outward and to inspire others to be self-reflective. You know, there becomes a moment where we get to a tipping point that we have such a powerful collective of aware people who have done the work that we then get really fabulous policy ultimately, because all of the conversations have happened. Oh, this was how I lived my childhood. And, you know, I'm aware that I grew up in a school where I didn't see other children with disabilities. And I have a certain conditioning and a patterning and belief system around that I wasn't aware of. But now I know, so I'm going to create a different kind of housing policy because now I see that and I know that about myself. So, you know, all of these different layers and levels are so inextricably bound. So, you know, yes, we need to be vigorous advocates and focusing on what's happening in the federal landscape, and simultaneously movement building at the community and grassroots and municipal level, so that we're all very well sourced for a very, you know, challenging landscape. So
you know, I think that that's a great approach to it, and to do it at a slow rate without getting excited or hyperventilating. You know, many people, because of what they perceive as some really bad things happening, are very down on the future and what could happen. My advice to everybody is that you should not reach for the panic button until it's absolutely necessary. And I question whether it's absolutely necessary right now. There is still a lot of things that are going to happen, and we're just going to have to see how things turn out. So, Alyssa, how can I get involved in the Connecticut Age Well Collaborative, or how can anyone who sees this video, how can they get involved?
Yeah, so the community conversation guide is a great place to start. So our website is ctagewellcollaborative.org, ctagewellcollaborative.org, or you can just search Connecticut Age Well Collaborative. And under the What to Do tab, you'll see our campaign, Every Age, Every Ability. And that's one avenue. Another avenue that I didn't mention yet is making this an all ages conversation, right? The way you movement build is it's not just the impacted group, but you get everyone excited about a topic. So we did something that's maybe a little unconventional. We're an organization that helps older adults find voice and try to convince municipal leaders to create communities that are supportive across the lifespan. And it's often older adults that care most about that issue. So, what did we do? We wrote a children's book. We wrote a book. It was published by a kids company, which publishes variety of books about topics to create to be conversation starters with kids. They're meant to be read child and adult together. So we wrote a book called A Kid's Book About Ageism, and it also speaks to these interrelated issues of ableism. And it's really meant to, one, normalize aging as the process of living, as we talked about in the beginning, and two, catalyze conversation. So I would encourage people to check out A Kid's Book About Ageism. It's available on all major retail online booksellers. And if your library doesn't yet have a copy, we encourage your organization to advocate, or if you're an individual, to advocate to see if copies can be purchased. And we also will be opening a program later this spring that towns can apply to if they'd like the Connecticut Age Well Collaborative to come out and do an event in your community. So that's yet another way to get involved.
Amazing. I like that children's book. It should be required reading for all children at some point. And it looks like we may have another Q&A. Yes, I've started a local SEPTO, special education PTO, in my new community, having benefited from one in my prior community. Do you have any resources or suggestions for organizing a well-functioning SEPTO? Krista, you actually asked the right guy. I've been involved in starting SEPTOs and parent support groups for parents of children with who are in special ed or who have disabilities. I've been doing that for 20 years. Please send me an email, kdaly@pathct.org. I would be happy to talk with you and help you in starting a SEPTO. Right now, I'm working on helping parents in Farmington start a SEPTO, and there are some very good SEPTOs all around. There's one in Brookfield, there's one in Newington. Um, Kind of off topic, so I won't rant too much about it. But SEPTOs are a way for parents to support each other, and the fact that we have kids with special needs, we have some special needs ourselves, and SEPTOs go to meet those needs. So Krista, please, I hope to hear from you. All right. And I think that covers everything that we have in Q&A and chat. Alyssa, thank you so much for being with us. And I hope you can
That's a pleasure.
come back and join us again real soon.
Thanks so much, Kevin. I appreciate it.
All right. And we will see you at the next edition of Answers on March 18th at 6:30 p.m. as the journey continues. Bye.